Good morning, good afternoon, or good night, and welcome to Command Power, the show in which we discuss all things Magic the Gathering with a focus on Commander. And today we have a brand new deck for you, and just as a quick heads up, this is not a budget deck, although I do think it should be fairly easy to find substitutes for those expensive cards. But before that, just a quick reminder to please click like and subscribe if you enjoy my videos. We're well on our way to 1 million subscribers, and every single click counts. And today's deck is going to be focused around Admiral Brass Unsinkable. For 2 colorless, 1 blue, 1 black, and 1 red, it's a legendary creature human pirate 3/3 with when Admiral Brass Unsinkable enters the battlefield, mill 4 cards. At the beginning of combat on your turn, you may return target pirate card from your graveyard to the battlefield with a finality counter on it. It has base power and toughness 4/4. It gains haste until end of turn. If a creature with a finality counter on it would die, exile it instead. So when I first looked at this card, I thought, this is a kind of weird commander. It kind of wants you to care about milling and reanimating and pirates and all those things. And from what I've heard, the precon is not that great. However, I've got a very interesting twist on this card, which I think makes it so much better, and that is that there are a few cards in the game that allow you to give all creature types to creatures in your graveyard, at which point this becomes a free reanimate every combat step, which is incredibly powerful, particularly since it fuels itself when it first enters the battlefield. So with that in mind, we're going to build a very special kind of reanimator deck that's going to involve changing the card types of the creatures in our graveyard. Another cool thing you can do with Admiral Brass is blink the creatures once you've returned them, which means that the finality thing won't actually happen and they'll get to come back as regular creatures. So that's what we're going to be building towards, and I think this deck looks incredibly fun. So without further ado, let's get started. And we're starting off with our Chaomancer, which is going to allow us to rebuy some of our key cards when it enters the battlefield. This can be either reanimation spells or blink effects, and it just works very well with what the deck is trying to do. Archon of Cruelty is a really powerful reanimation target. It's probably the single best reanimation target we have access to. It gives us an immense amount of value, and is particularly good when we get to flicker it and have it enter the battlefield again. Burning Rune Demon is a really important card in the deck because when it ETBs, you can search up 2 of those cards that give all creature types to things in your graveyard. Since your opponent is going to make you discard 1, you can always keep the other, and there you go, you've already found the crucial card in your deck. Coercive Recruiter is very good in this deck because once we've got our key cards in play, all the creatures in our deck are going to be pirates. That means that we can steal our opponent's stuff, and since we also have a blink sub-theme, we can get to keep the stuff that we steal. Deadeye Navigator is one of the blink cards that we're running. It doesn't really work with cards we steal from our opponents, but for everything else, including cards we reanimate with our commander, this is really fantastic, and it's going to allow us to keep those creatures permanently. Diluvian Primordial is a good reanimation target that's going to give us a lot of value late game. Gemcutter Buccaneer is there basically just for the treasure making effect. It is going to help us ramp, and this is a very mana intensive deck, so we do like this kind of effect. Goblin Engineer is fantastic because 2 of the cards that give all creature types to creatures in graveyards are artifacts, so we can search them and put them into the graveyard with this, and one of them even costs less than 3 mana, so we can reanimate it the next turn. Izzet Chronarch is another version of our Chaomancer to rebuy us some of our important sorceries and instants. Mnemonic Wall is yet a 3rd version of this effect. We really want ways to buy back those kind of cards in this deck, as you'll see later on. Molten Primordial is another decent finisher, particularly if we have a way to blink the creatures we steal so that we can keep them permanently. Necron Deathmark is fantastic in this deck, either as a setup or as a reanimation target, because we get to mill ourselves, which means that we can put important stuff into the graveyard that we can then reanimate. Phantom Steed works well with all of the ETBs we've got. It can be a great protection against board wipe, or it can just be a way to stop a removal spell. It also happens to work really well with finality counters. Phyrexian Delver is a great target to reanimate because it brings back another creature with it when it comes into play. We can also just hard cast it as another reanimation spell. Puppeteer Click is very powerful in this deck because of all of the blink effects that we're running, but it's also just a good card in general. Ravenous Chupacabra is good removal on a stick that we can recur in this deck. Sepulchral Primordial is one of our best reanimation targets because it comes with 3 other creatures attached. That is hard to beat, particularly when you're blinking it or getting it back in other ways. Shieldred Whispering One gives us a lot of value if we can keep it alive, and we should be able to keep it alive fairly easily in this deck. Skeleton Crew is a really interesting card. It's going to buff our whole team, but we're basically playing it because it's going to give us some extra bodies whenever cards leave our graveyard, which should be happening quite a bit. Thassa Deep Dwelling is great in this deck because it allows us to blink a creature at the end of each of our turns, which is going to get rid of finality counters, rebuy ETBs, and permanently steal our opponent's creatures. The Cyber Controller is here for a couple of reasons. First, it mills our opponents, which is something we do want in this deck since we are sometimes reanimating stuff from their graveyards, but then also it gives us all these creatures that we can blink in order to just steal them permanently, which is very strong. Titan of Littjara should be fantastic in in the deck, it's going to be drawing a lot of cards, seeing as all of our deck is going to be pirates once we switch to the creature types. Not only that, but it allows us to discard one of the cards after we've drawn, thus filling our graveyard. Zephyr Sentinel is a lot better than it looks in this deck because we can bounce a creature with a finality counter on it to our hand, thus bypassing the downside. For sorceries, we have Breach the Multiverse, which is an absolute beast in this deck. It's a really powerful spell on its own, but when we're running this kind of reanimation strategy, it gets even better. Fabricate allows us to search up one of the important artifacts in our deck that's going to grant all creature types. Haunting Voyage should be amazing if we get to foretell it. We're going to bring back all of the creatures from our graveyard, which should help win us the game if it's gone long. Incarnation Technique works really nicely by being a double reanimation spell. You can just get lucky sometimes, like I did in a game recently, and just drop 2 huge fatties on turn 5. It's particularly good when you hit Sepulchral Primordial with this, because then you very likely get to steal something from the player who you just targeted with a demonstrate copy. Moving on to instance, we have Ghostly Flicker, which is very important and is one of the main reasons we're running so many cards that rebuy instants and sorceries from our graveyard. This works so well with all of our steal effects and with our finality counters. Lethal Scheme and Pile On are very similar cards. They both are a very cheap removal if we have creatures to tap for them, for example our commander, and they also allow us to put cards into our graveyard, which we often want to be doing, so they're just very strong in this deck. Moving on to enchantments, we have Arcane Adaptation. This is one of the crucial cards in the deck that can allow us to change all creature types. Conspiracy is another one of those effects. This is probably the worst of the bunch because it's the most expensive and it also overwrites other creature types, which sometimes is relevant, as you'll see in a moment. Kindred Discovery should draw us a lot of cards with all of the pirates that we're going to be having. Molten Echoes is going to give us extra copies of everything we reanimate or cast, which is going to be incredibly strong. And Reflections of Littjara only works when we cast a spell, but we do get to keep the creature permanently, which is again very strong. Moving on to artifacts, we're playing Altar of the Wretched, basically just for the front side, which allows us a sack outlet and a mill outlet, which is very good. Arm Mounted Anchor allows us to push some damage through, and if we have any of our creature type changing effects, it's card advantage. Ashes of the Fallen is yet another way we can change creature types in graveyard. Brass's Tunnel Grinder is really solid. We get to discard a bunch of stuff and draw as many cards as we want, and then we should be descending almost every turn with this, which means it's soon going to flip into something that allows us to discover. Very, very strong. Conjurer's Closet works well by allowing us to bypass the finality counters and permanently steal our opponent's creatures. Maskwood Nexus is the best version of the effect that's going to give us all creature types. It even allows us to make little tokens that can trigger a lot of our effects. Matzalantli is really strong in this deck. Looting is great, and then being able to flip it and add a ton of mana just works very nicely because we are quite mana hungry. Relic of Sauron doesn't only tap for a bunch of mana, it can also draw and discard, which again fuels our graveyard. The Everflowing Well is a great way to fill up the graveyard by milling 2. The flip side isn't usually that useful because most of our creatures work on ETBs, but it's still nice to have the option. The Indomitable is so good in this deck. It's a coastal piracy that is incredibly hard to remove because we're going to get to recast it from our graveyard if they do kill it. Throne of the Grim Captain is sweet in this deck. So we get to mill cards with it, which is obviously good, but the thing is in this deck we actually have a realistic chance of crafting it if we get out Maskwood Nexus, which would be absolutely hilarious because the flip side is an absolute beast of a card that should be almost impossible to deal with barring a board wipe. Finally, for artifacts, we have Whip of Erebos. This is always nice to have as a way to give you survivability, and it can even reanimate stuff in a pinch. Moving on to lands, we have Bojuka Bog to deal with our opponent's graveyards. This is very important, and I put it in almost every black deck. Desolate Lighthouse and Nephalia Drownyard are both quite similar. Desolate Lighthouse is a little bit better because we do get to draw a card, but they both allow us to fill our graveyard. And Ghost Quarter and Tectonic Edge are 2 ways to deal with problem lands from our opponents. We are stealing some creatures, so we do want to have a way to answer something like Homeward Pass. So there you have it. That has been our Admiral Brass Unsinkable deck tech. I think this is one of the most unique ones I've come up with in a while. Do let me know in the comment section below what you think about this deck. Are there any cards you would have added? Any things you wouldn't have included? Let me know in the comment section below. I read all comments and respond to all of them too. And if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to click like or subscribe. It really helps the channel. And until next time, take care.